A lot has happened during the past year and a half at WNL, in the nation, and of course across the globe. During times of upheaval and stress, the values that feel most important to us can become clearer, or they can change. The Mudd Center's program this year will focus our attention on daily ethics. That's how, or if, our personal values are actually manifested in the actions and decisions of our daily lives. Since our habits cumulatively shape our lives and the world around us, we'll think together about the impact of our daily ethics as well. The Daily Ethics Lecture Series will include 10 distinguished speakers from different disciplinary and professional backgrounds. They'll address big questions like defining a meaningful life and making a difference, using information and constructing knowledge in our lives, navigating the responsibilities of being a citizen in our communities, of a nation, the world, and the earth. I think the WNL community will be inspired by how our speakers' personal values have been manifested in their professional choices and activities as well. The Daily Ethics Mosaic Project is an especially exciting part of our program this year. The Mudd Center is partnering with the Stanier Gallery and with the artist Jonathan Lee to offer a series of workshops this fall that will culminate in the production of a large-scale community artwork. After so much isolation, the prospect of working on a community project together feels great. The Mosaic workshops will involve individual art making as well as collaborative art making. So students, staff, and faculty will have a chance to think deeply about their own values and choices, and also discuss and create a collective product. I can't wait. All right, welcome everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? All right. I'm Carla Murdoch. I'm director of the Mudd Center for Ethics, and today we will be treated to the 7th lecture in our Daily Ethics series. So our series focuses on how our individual choices and habits express our values and how they shape our world. We've approached this topic from multiple perspectives so far this year. The philosopher Cheshire Calhoun discussed the responsibilities and tensions of deciding in our own minds how things ought to be, as well as practicing morality with other people. Jelani Cobb contextualized the brief history of our democracy and alerted us to the need for collaborative and intentional actions to maintain it. Andrew Chignell proposed that hopeful pessimism is required for us to work on actualizing our values within the complex realities of our time. The playwright Chantal Bilodeau described her work and her vision for art and science to achieve synergistically a critical moral issue of our time and solutions to it, climate change. Last month, the materials scientist and renewable energy entrepreneur Jay Whitaker discussed the ethical challenges that are associated with developing and making accessible in our daily lives innovative products for energy storage. So today, I'm delighted to introduce Neeru Paharia. She's an associate professor in the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, and her research focuses on the conditions under which consumers are likely to wield their buying power to express their personal values and enact social change. A secondary focus of her research examines how people signal their social status through using high-status brands or communicating to others how busy they are. Professor Paharia's work has taken an explicitly applied focus. She utilizes experimental methods to collect real-world data with an aim to impact practice and have a positive influence on business and society. She was a member of the founding team and executive director of Creative Commons, which now has over 1 billion openly licensed works on the internet. And she has co-founded several community-oriented social networking sites in education, research, and music. Her work has been profiled in a number of prominent media outlets, including the New York Times, NPR's Morning Edition, and the Washington Post. And her work was featured in a recent episode of one of my favorite podcasts, which is Hidden Brain. So make sure and check that out. Professor Paharia's lecture today will address the ethics of consumer choice. So please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
All right. Well, thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here and to take some time to talk about how our choices as consumers impact the world and how everything we do has a consequence to it. And so this is a perfect theme. The daily ethics theme fits quite nicely with my research. I am a professor of marketing. And one of the reasons I got into this field was that I was very curious about how consumption is really sort of the end state to a lot of our sustainability concerns, and that consumption really has a huge impact on all the kind of global issues that we're facing today. So that is what I will talk about, the consequences of consumption. And when I talk about this, when we think about ethics and consumption, I usually operationalize that in terms of the environmental and labor impacts of these consumptions and the negative externalities that may result. So just to start, I think the way that I think the show The Good Place perfectly captures so many of the tensions we see as being a human, but they articulated my whole talk in about 30 seconds. So I'll play that for you, and then we'll kind of delve into the more academic side of things.
Life now is so complicated. It's impossible for anyone to be good enough for the good place. I know you don't like to learn too much about life on Earth to remain impartial, but these days just buying a tomato at a grocery store means that you are unwittingly supporting toxic pesticides, exploiting labor, contributing to global warming. Humans think that they're making one choice, but they're actually making dozens of choices they don't even know they're making.
Okay, so now we can all go home. Okay, jokes aside. So the consumption we make and how that impacts things. And so there are three kind of angles I want to talk about here as we explore this topic about the tomato and the consequences of that tomato. So one is the growth imperative. So the kind of the foundations of our capitalist society and the fact that we have to continually grow. Why the system is set up so that we don't care, and then some kind of potential solutions. So the growth imperative. So we all know we live in a capitalist system, right? And in this system, we have to consume, and we have to consume more and more and more each year. Otherwise, our stock price will go down, right? So you're always looking for some kind of growth. And the way that growth happens is either through getting people to consume more or finding more consumers, right? So we need to think about, we're thinking about the global economy, and there's always more consumers across the globe that we can tap into. But the problem with all this consumption is that we live on Earth, and on this planet, we have finite resources, right? So there's only so much that we can consume. And they've actually estimated that if we think about the increasing size of the consumer class in the world, we would need another Earth to manage all those finite resources. So we're over-consuming with a limited amount of resources. And also, all this consumption and all this production really creates a lot of negative externalities. And so what I mean by that is that in the production process, we might pollute the environment, right? And so who pays for that? It doesn't get paid for by the company, and it might not get paid for by the consumer. And so then who pays for it? The whole world, maybe from a global warming perspective when we think about carbon emissions, or maybe a particular local community where a factory might be located. But in either case, there are negative externalities from all this production and all this consumption that isn't getting priced into the product. So the company isn't paying for it, and nor is the consumer. But in reality, somebody is always paying for it, right? There's always somebody having to pay that cost. And to really kind of make that tangible, they've estimated that fossil fuel emissions are the cause of 1 in 5 deaths in the world. 1 in 5 deaths from fossil fuel emissions. So just from all that production, all that use of fossil fuel, we have 1 in 5 people dying prematurely. Much of that is actually being driven by the production of some kind of consumer goods. So consumer goods drive a lot of the carbon emissions, a lot of the water withdrawals, and deforestation. So we're thinking about consumption is one of the main drivers of a lot of these externalities. So given that, we're kind of rational people. Let's just consume less or consume more sustainably, right? Why don't we just do that? That's probably a pretty easy thing to do. Well, as consumers, we are constantly battling the growth imperative, right? The capitalism and the growth imperative. And so what does that mean for us is that marketing can sometimes create needs that we don't necessarily have inherently. So in the case of the tomato, we all kind of need to eat. That seems like a pretty standard, legitimate need. So that's something we can maybe justify pretty easily. But my favorite example of generating a need is the story of the diamond. So diamonds, actually, the market for the diamond engagement ring in particular did not exist until it was created in the 30s and 40s by the De Beers Corporation. So they not only restricted the supply, but they generated the demand. They basically invented the whole norm of using diamond engagement rings. And so there's some interesting things here that we can think about that make this particular example really telling about our roles as consumers and how we're able to kind of resist these kinds of campaigns. So when we think about diamonds, there are some really interesting things. So one is that I can create a diamond. Well, I can't, but one can create a diamond, an actual diamond, in the lab for 1/10 of the price. Now this diamond, this lab-created diamond, is so close in structure to a natural diamond that you would need equipment that costs between $20,000 and $40,000 to actually tell the difference. So no regular person is going to be able to tell the difference between a lab-created diamond and a natural diamond, and it's 1/10 of the price. So that would argue, well, there's a perfect substitute, right? We know this in economics. This is essentially kind of a perfect substitute in a sense. No one can tell the difference. Some might argue that diamonds have value because you can sell them. You can resell them, right? It's a good investment. But actually, that's not true either. The resale market for diamonds is terrible. Max, in a very optimistic scenario, you can get maybe 30%, but really it ranges from about 5 to 30% of the price you paid. Some people say diamonds are valuable because they're scarce, but that's also not true. So tanzanite is more scarce than a diamond. In fact, you can only get tanzanite from a 3 square mile location in Tanzania. That is the only place you can get that particular gemstone. It is much more rare than a diamond, but it is only a third of the value, the third of the price. And so it's not really scarcity. But I guess another thing about scarcity that I think is interesting is that how many of you know someone who has a diamond? Or you might have one yourself, right? Right? It's not very scarce, right? I could throw a rock and hit somebody who has a diamond, right? It's not that scarce. Everyone has one. If you're talking about something scarce, like a Lamborghini, right? Like not many people have a Lamborghini, but pretty much, actually, the number is about 80% of engaged women in this country have had a diamond at some point. Finally, if we think about scarcity, there's just sort of false idea that things are valuable because they're scarce. But that's not true, because everything is kind of scarce in a way, right? Like this shoe that I've been wearing, and I've worn down in a very unique way, is very scarce. There is no shoe like this. But is anyone going to pay me $10,000 for this shoe that I wore in a very specific way, and therefore it is now scarce, right? It doesn't totally add up. And yet, we do sort of kind of react to these kinds of appeals. So, on top of all that, you even have the former chairman of the De Beers Corporation saying diamonds are intrinsically worthless. And yet, diamonds are very valuable. People pay for them. And why do they do that? Well, one of the reasons is because they have a symbolic value. So we purchase things because they have a functional value, right? Like a sponge, you can clean your dishes. We purchase things because they have an emotional value. You buy a piece of chocolate cake and you eat it and it makes you very happy. Or you buy a diamond and it has this kind of symbolic value. And this symbolic value, such as love or identity or social status, can be very meaningful. And one of the reasons why we need these kind of symbols in our lives is because we are these kind of ephemeral beings. So your thoughts kind of come and go, right? Like they're never the same. You have this sort of constant stream of thoughts and images and ideas in your head. But a physical product is tangible. It stays constant over time, and it reminds us of who we are, what we value, and in this case, that other people value us. So these symbols can be really important. And we can combine that with these kinds of these theories of conspicuous consumption and wastefulness. So how do we show our social status? And diamonds is one way, right? Expensive diamonds. But one of the ideas here is that we can show our social status and our social elevation by wasting resources. And one of the ideas that kind of helps understand this or puts this in perspective is, a long time ago, wealthy people used to grow lawns because they didn't need the space to grow food, right? They had enough land to grow food, or they had enough money to buy food. They didn't need to use that land to grow food. They could waste it, essentially, in growing a lawn, right? And so then lawns became the symbol of having a lot of resources, and that meant that you had a lot of social status. And so that is one of the things that we do with the diamond. So instead of other animals who might fight to be kind of the top dog, and koalas seem really cute, but I watched this documentary about koalas, and they're actually quite terrible to each other. They're super mean. And the whole show was about how this kind of, the top dog koala just beat up all the other koalas and took all this territory for himself and kept all the female koalas, right? And so he was able to achieve the highest level on that particular social hierarchy through physical aggression. We do that with products, right? With symbolic products. That's how we kind of create our status. We don't necessarily need to fight one another, but we might fight one another with our money, using these kinds of symbols. And so the diamonds and with these really, really, really wealthy people, they go in and bid up the price of these paintings, and then that one painting now ends up being worth a lot of money. So that is the insight that the diamond marketers like De Beers and NW Ayers, their marketing agency, really keyed in on, which was that they decided to make the diamond engagement ring a symbolic product, right? A psychological necessity that could compete with utility goods and services. And that was, at the time, in the 30s and the 40s, think of that particular moment in time, right? We're talking about World War II, that kind of era where functional products and utility products were really valuable. And now you're going to convince people that they should buy a shiny rock. Was a really crazy idea. And yet, it totally worked, right? Because they were able to instill the idea that diamonds are equated with love. And of course, love is priceless. And so then the question is, how much are you willing to pay for eternal love? And the answer is, of course, I'm willing to pay anything. It's priceless, right? What that equated to was, at first, 1 month's salary, and then when the profits weren't enough, it ended up being 2 months' salary, and now they're saying 3 months' salary, right? There's a constant inflation of how much I should be willing to love you based on how much I spend on this diamond engagement ring. So this campaign was super successful. So in 1939, 10% of US brides got diamond engagement rings. By the end of the 20th century, it was 80%. So we just kind of assume that we need diamond engagement rings, but if you kind of step back and reflect on it, it was something that was generated by a marketing campaign, and it's still alive and well today. J-Lo got a $1.8 million ring from A-Rod recently. Demi Lovato got $1 million ring, right? These people are really kind of showing that they're the top koala and that they're loved more than any of us because they have such expensive rings. So you could say, well, maybe this was a fluke. This is just the diamond, this was just some weird thing that happened. And this doesn't generalize in any other way. But it really does. I mean, think of the whole market for luxury products, right? So this is an Hermes bag. This particular bag costs $14,000. How much of that how much of that do you think went into the actual production of the bag, right? Like, you know, and if I just needed a bag to carry around stuff, I think I could do that for maybe $100 and probably even less. Like maybe this is really durable, really long lasting, so let's just say $1,000. But most of what you're buying here is symbolic value. Take that, and even a more extreme example, if anyone has heard of this brand Supreme, they just put their brand name on a Hanes tagless tee, which costs $10, and then they charge $100 for it, right? So again, kind of selling a symbolic value. And in reality, most products have some element of all these things. So a BMW, really high quality car, right? It'll get you there in comfort. You get some functional value, you get some emotional value, but you also get some symbolic value, right? You get some status value, some kind of esteem, and similar for Apple and Lululemon. So that's all to say that marketing ties into the fabric of culture. And so most Americans, I would imagine, just assume that the diamond engagement ring is a necessity. And they don't really think that what the counterfactual is. If there hadn't been a campaign by De Beers, this wouldn't be happening, right? We would not have this tradition. And we are social creatures, though. And so one of the things that really works to enforce this is the fact that we kind of look to others to understand what we should do. So if you don't get a diamond engagement ring, there is some social enforcement that will kind of pressure you into getting it, right? So we want to look good, and we want to look like we're kind of doing what everybody else is doing. So there's some social pressure to fit in. But these needs are manufactured to some extent by marketing. This campaign might not have been successful, and actually they tried it in Brazil, and they tried it in Europe, and it didn't really work. And so the whole concept of a diamond engagement ring doesn't exist in those countries. They just wear like simple kind of like gold wedding bands. So that just kind of leads us to kind of take a step back. So we're thinking about ethics and everyday choices and the role of the consumer. When you take a step back, you've got to ask yourself the question, what is the value of a system where labor is expended and environmental harm is created purely in the pursuit of a symbolic product, right? That has no functional value and no aesthetic benefit beyond a perfect substitute, which is a lab-created diamond. So all of this is to say that this is kind of crazy, right? Like this is kind of crazy, and it was all kind of manufactured by a really brilliant marketing campaign. And our ability to resist these things is somewhat limited as consumers. Again, like these things become part of the culture and they become socially reinforced. And so even though we think we are rational, when you kind of take a step back and look at the whole thing, it doesn't necessarily always add up. That is probably one of the most extreme examples I can think of, but we can think of a lot of other examples where marketing was really crucial in changing what we consider to be needs. So we can look at the beauty industry, right? Before the early 1900s, the expectation that as a woman you would wear makeup did not exist. Makeup was used for actors and people of that nature, like people on the stage, right? It wasn't necessarily something that the common person would wear, and there were even like laws against it in certain places. But again, marketing kind of built up this beauty standard that we all have to wear a certain amount of makeup in certain situations to look a certain way. Every time there's a new iPhone, right? What do you do? How do you feel about your old iPhone? It's slow, it doesn't work as well, right? And in fact, they've actually found that people just sort of like accidentally crack their screen more often when the new version comes out, right? So when the new version comes out, people just somehow like drop their old iPhone and, oh, the screen cracked. I guess I need to get a new one, right? So again, we're constantly being we're constantly being kind of pushed to the newer versions of the phones. H&M, right? The current fashion that I have right now isn't enough. I gotta kind of move on to the next look that's coming up here. So while some of our consumption is, probably based more on function and need, like the tomato, a lot of our consumption gets created and manufactured, which would be okay, except that we go back to the fact that consumption has negative externalities and we're consuming finite resources, right? So there are some costs to all this consumption. And so when there are all these costs, it also leads us to ask a question of why we don't care more about some of these costs. So that will be the next kind of topic I delve into. So again, we're talking about negative externalities and finite resources. So we may be prompted to consume all these products and services, some that we need, some that are sort of manufactured by marketing. But surely as consumers, we are aware that there are some costs with this consumption, both in terms of the finite resources and the negative externalities, and that we should probably care about them. And actually, people do say they care about them. And there is this really interesting paradox that when you ask consumers, do you care about sustainability, and are you willing to pay for more sustainable alternatives? Most people will say, yes, I am. I'm willing to pay for more sustainable alternatives. But when we kind of look in the marketplace, there's just not much, right? Like, it doesn't really seem like that's happening. There isn't much in terms of more sustainable alternatives, or at least products that are explicitly, clearly sustainably produced. So why is that? Why do we have this paradox? And this is kind of where a lot of my research comes in, and it's about just sort of thinking about why consumers don't necessarily care. Why do they say they care, but then in the end, it doesn't really seem like their caring translates into any kind of action? So the first thing we can think about is maybe these surveys are wrong, right? Like maybe people aren't giving us an honest answer. And to that we could kind of just say, like, yeah, there could be some kind of like social desirability, right? Yeah, of course I care about sustainability. And I think a funny kind of anecdote here is with a Porsche. So if I ask a person, why would you buy a Porsche? Most people will say, well, it's like an excellent driving machine. The leather is very comfortable. It drives really fast. I like the way it feels. Okay, all very justifiable. Now, if I ask, why would your neighbor buy a Porsche? Think about what that answer is. Why would your neighbor buy a Porsche? Show off, right? All they care about is social status. They're just trying to show off. So these surveys could be wrong because we're just asking the question in a wrong way, right? Like maybe the question is, would your neighbor pay for sustainability? That may be the case. It could just be an information problem. So considering that we don't actually, as consumers, know what is going on in terms of production, it's not very transparent. These companies are producing these products in faraway locations oftentimes, and maybe even subcontracting to another firm outside the boundary of their own firm. So there's just very little clear and concrete information as a consumer that you can get about a product's sustainability. And I think one that really often surprises people is how much child labor there is in the farming of cocoa. And this has been sort of like, if you read up on it, it's been a topic of discussion for the last 20 years. But even in 2019, they're saying that the chances that your chocolate bar bought in the US, the chances that there was some child labor in that, unless you buy something that is like Rainforest Alliance certified or something like that, the chances are quite high because it is quite pervasive in the supply chain. So maybe we just don't have the information, right? If you don't know, then it's not really going to impact your choice. But maybe we do know, actually. I was in Professor Sunday's class today, and And one of the students said, she asked, do you think people are aware that products that people purchase in Walmart and Target, are not produced sustainably? Do you think they're aware of that? And I had to I don't know for sure, but I think people just sort of have an intuitive sense that if it's really cheap, there's got to be a reason why, right? Like there's got to be a reason why if something's really cheap that it is cheap. So maybe people do know, and maybe they do know because like we kind of see these things in the news a lot, right? Like there's constantly this information about different companies and how they're producing sustainably or not. So companies have been the target of public criticism. So maybe people don't care. Maybe we have this paradox because there's like a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem. So I like to use this example. I'm a professor and I need to buy suits. And I would love to buy a suit that was produced sustainably. You try and find a suit that was produced sustainably. Good luck. It does not exist, right? Like there are no options. Zero, right? Zero. I would have to go hire somebody to make a suit for me. And that's probably the only way I could get that to be produced in a sustainable fashion. So there are a lack of options right now. So maybe it's a chicken and an egg problem. Maybe consumers are willing to pay more money for these kinds of products, but companies people are buying stuff the way they are now, so why change, right? They're not really seeing the benefit of it, and so they're not necessarily addressing that particular concern. So that's kind of like some information problems and maybe just some sort of disconnects in the market. We can also think about these like more psychological drivers. So one is called willful ignorance. And the idea here is that I don't want to know, right? As a consumer, I'd like to just go buy my shoes and move on. Like I don't really want to know about the sustainability information because then that's going to make me have this kind of dissonance in my head, right? Now I'm going to have to be thinking, well, now that I know this information, I can't forget it, and then I have to make a decision that might not be in line with my own ethical values. So instead of doing that, I might just try and avoid the information altogether, right? So the information may be out there, but I just don't want to know it, right? So I'm not going to look it up. I'm not going to try and find it because it's going to make things a little bit harder for me psychologically. Similarly, we can try and justify things. And so if you see an iPhone and you really love it, and you find that maybe something not so great happened in the production, and I'm not saying that's true, but let's just using it as an example because everyone really loves their iPhones, you might be more likely to justify that purchase using these kinds of real economic justifications. And there is real debate about this, about whether things like sweatshop labor are bad or good. And some economists will argue that they're actually favorable because they help companies develop economically. And this is sort of a necessary step in their evolution. But what we find is if you show somebody a really nice product, they're more likely to agree with these statements, like sweatshops are the only realistic source of incomes for workers in poorer countries. They're more likely to agree with those statements than if you show them a really ugly pair of shoes. And then they'll say, well, sweatshop labor is wrong. So it turns out people are motivated to rationalize why it's okay to buy these products because they really want to buy them. So our morality or our moral beliefs we don't think about morality like scientists, like as an objective right and wrong. We think about it more like we're a lawyer. So I want the shoes, so how do I kind of back into that? How do I back out of that it's actually okay for me to purchase those shoes? So those are some kind of motivated processes. There are other processes that are kind of set up on just how the whole system is organized. So again, production often happens in faraway locations, very diffuse, right? It's not even that a specific company is doing it, but they might be subcontracting, and they might be subcontracting, and they might be subcontracting. So who's responsible, right? Who is responsible? There's a huge diffusion of responsibility here. It's far away, and there's so many chains in the process, chains of agency in the process, that it becomes unclear who at all is responsible for when some of these bad things happen. Along those lines, there's also this idea of agency. So one of the interesting things happened in the era of mass production was that we moved to what's called a made-to-stock economy. So there was a point in time where if I wanted clothes or I wanted a suit or something, I would go to a tailor and they would make that suit for me. And so my suit would be made to order. It would not exist until I ordered it. So the supply comes after the demand, right? Demand comes first, and the supply is then generated in order to meet my demand. When we move to mass production, we move to a made-to-stock economy. So what does that mean? That means I'm going to produce 10,000 suits. They're going to be in 3 sizes, and now I have to kind of figure out how to get you to buy them. But the other thing a made-to-stock economy does is it eliminates the agency. So as you as a consumer had nothing to do with whether that suit was produced or not, how it was produced, you had no role in that. And so when you walk into the store and you pick up that suit off the rack, it makes no difference whether you buy it or not. The damage has been done. If there was any damage, any kind of environmental or labor issues that were involved in that, you're not causing that to happen anymore. And because of that, you don't really feel that responsible, right? You're like, well, somebody else already, so we already have the problem of indirectness and diffusion of responsibility. So somebody else made the suit, and it's already been made. I have nothing to do with it. So again, we don't really have much agency over production. And so that is based on, in part, our system of mass production. So to kind of like put this in perspective, one question I like to ask, to kind of make this really clear, is this question of, would you lock a child in your basement and have them make your clothes for you? And the answer to that for most people is no, at least I hope it's no. But that is kind of what we're doing, right? In a very kind of abstract and diffuse and non-agentic way, you are essentially hiring a company to do those things for you. But it doesn't really feel that bad because, again, it's far away. The information is unclear. There's so many different actors in the chain, and you never caused that to happen at all anyways, right? They did it already, and you're just going to the store and buying something, and whatever you do isn't really going to make a difference. So, one last thing before we start talking about solutions is this idea of durability. So one of the other things as consumers that we don't really consider is durability. And so I think this really kind of took a big turn with H&M, where we got sort of addicted to kind of like fast fashion and disposable clothing. But one of the things consumers sort of fail to think about when they're making a purchase is how long-lasting products are. So it doesn't necessarily get priced in. So if you're going to the store and you see a $20 shirt or you see a $100 shirt, it's not always clear that one is better than the other. But oftentimes, the $100 shirt is going to last a lot longer. But consumers don't necessarily recognize that. So thinking about ways to make that more tangible can also help. Okay, so kind of taking a step back, again, marketing manufacturers needs, but the whole system is kind of set up so that we don't care, right? We don't have any agency, everything's produced far away. We're kind of motivated to ignore some of this stuff. So it's kind of set up so that we don't really think about these costs. So we're encouraged to consume, and we're also kind of like structurally encouraged to not care about the costs, the negative externalities, and the finite resources. So what do we do? What are the solutions here? How do we move forward? So again, we have this kind of situation that stems from consumption, and we're thinking about how our choices, our daily choices, our individual choices can be used to kind of express our values in the world. How do we live in a world where that paradox that I care about sustainability is no longer a paradox, that I care about it and my actions are in line with what I care about? So we can think about three actors in this system. We can think about the consumer, we can think about companies, and we can think about government. So consumers can choose to consume more sustainably, if that's an option, because sometimes it's not. We can think about companies to produce more sustainably. And we can think about governments and using regulation to kind of narrow in on some of this stuff. So from a consumer's perspective, some interesting things have been happening recently where there's almost been a confluence, or just sort of a convergence, actually, of these two identities that we have as consumers. So on the one side, we have the consumer, right? You're a consumer and you purchase things and that's it. It's like kind of an amoral domain. And then you enact your moral will and your values and your beliefs in the civic space, right? You're a citizen, you vote. You know, that's the way to take care of this, right? The commercial sphere and the citizen sphere are completely different. But what we're finding recently is that citizens are kind of feeling like they can kind of enact their power in society through their dollar, through the marketplace. So there's become this sort of convergence of these two identities where consumers feel like the marketplace is where to enact their moral and their kind of political values. And one reason this may be is because, you know, there has been a feeling that our traditional political system has been somewhat, trust in our political institutions has declined severely, right, over the last several years. And at least in the US, our identities as consumers is very strong, right? We have a very strong consumer culture. So it makes sense that people would want to vote with their dollars. And you kind of see a lot of this, just at least in the political, kind of in a more, you know, a little bit outside of sustainability, but not necessarily completely divorced from it. But we see a lot of social and political issues being voted on by consumers when brands take political positions. And so this is sort of increasing and increasing over time. But we see this also with sustainability as well. So that could be one thing. So consumers are kind of feeling a bit more motivated. I feel like it is going up, the increase of thinking about moral and kind of ethical issues in the marketplace. But really it comes down to, if companies were to internalize these externalities and actually pay for them, will consumers pay a premium, right? Will you pay for some of those externalities? And so they've done some kind of thoughts, you know, some analysis on this, you know, and just as an example, in the chocolate industry, if they were to increase the wages by 40%, or the price that a farmer gets for the chocolate by 40%, that would add 10% to the price of a candy bar. 10%. So now instead of our chocolate bar being $1, it's $1.10, and we don't have child labor in the farming of chocolate. So that seems like somewhat reasonable, right? So some people, though, will still argue that's a burden on the consumer. We have to pay an extra 10 cents. That's a burden. But I would then kind of go back to like a counterfactual. So what if we had no labor laws in this country and no environmental regulation, zero? It would be kind of like a free-for-all, right? Like the price of that chocolate bar would not be $1, it'd be like 70 cents, right? Because we would have to account for all the labor in this country. And so you could make the same argument. Well, $1 is more expensive. And yet, as a society, we value having certain labor and environmental standards in this country. And so we are willing to pay the extra 30 cents, and now the chocolate bar is $1. So we kind of need to think collectively of what do we value. And if we value not having child labor farming our chocolate, then, if that's kind of the base that we're all going to commonly agree to, just sort of a common sense of humanity, then the new price is $1.10. But I can also kind of not necessarily take the other side, but argue for the idea that consumers shouldn't actually have the responsibility to think about this stuff. So if a company kind of worked all this out and wants to charge us more money, that's one thing. But in general, think about production. It happens in a faraway country, in companies that we have no access to. How, as a consumer, why, as a consumer, should I be responsible for monitoring how a company is producing their product, right? I'm just trying to feed my children and get to work and put dinner on the table and all the things, right? The time and energy it takes to monitor a company and make sure that everything is kind of above board is a lot for a consumer to be responsible for. So that would argue that we should think about some of these other entities that have more kind of concentrated levels of agency. So we can think about companies. So companies could produce products more sustainably. And of course, companies will always say that they don't need any accountability. So in the case of chocolate, the Chocolate Manufacturers Association, in response to some of these issues around child labor, said, we don't need legislation to deal with the problem. We are already acting. So that is not 100% untrue. They actually have improved a lot since this kind of all became a noticeable issue in the early 2000s. There has been a lot of improvement. But they don't necessarily want to be, they did not meet their targets. They have improved, but they have not eradicated the issue. And so they don't want to be controlled by legislation and by regulation. But at the same time, we do see companies starting to take more kind of moralistic positions. And this has been a trend, I'd say, over the last 10 years. And more recently, even just yesterday, McDonald's decided to pull out of Russia. And that's 9% of their revenue, right? 9% of their revenue, plus they're going to pay the workers. They're going to continue to pay the workers. So that is not an economic decision. I would argue that is a bit of a political, moral kind of decision. So companies are trying. There is always resistance. But one way we can kind of think about this, and again, this is sort of where my research is focused on, are what are some kind of market-based strategies? So we have all those issues we talked about that prevent consumers from making more sustainable choices, like information and this motivated reasoning and the lack of connection. So are there market-based solutions to overcome some of those issues? And so I would argue there are. So one, choice, right? So companies can offer more choices, right? And so we don't know if there's demand for these things yet, but we've got to try. And if you offer 3 or 4 kinds of suits, maybe people would buy them. So we need to have some options. Providing information, so transparency. So some companies like Everlane have been really big on transparency. So making the production process transparent. They use this transparent pricing model. Transparency on where the products are produced, how they're being produced, how much people are being paid, but offering more transparency is also really helpful from the consumer's perspective. Quantification. So, as a consumer, it can get really confusing. If you're trying to consume sustainably, what does that mean? I went to, 10 clothing brand websites, and they all have very different kinds of products. There'd be like 20% recycled fibers, or made with a water-preserving methodology. And so from a consumer's perspective, it can be really confusing, right? Like, I'm willing to pay more, but I just want to know what the impact of that will be. So having these kind of really tangible measures to help consumers understand, if you pay more, what is it that you're actually paying more for, can be quite helpful. Along with that, durability. So I mentioned the durability piece of it. So quantifying durability. So people will consume less fast fashion if you make it clear how much a $100 sweater will last. And if you can justify your price per wear actually might be cheaper, right? With a $100 sweater that lasts for 5 years versus a $20 sweater that lasts for 7 washes, your $100 sweater, you might be able to justify the cost if you calculate something like the price per wear and focus on the durability like Patagonia does. They even tell you to don't buy this jacket. Certification. So we were talking about the organic certification standards earlier and how they're maybe not as good as they should be. But certification helps again, I don't have time to monitor a factory. But Fair Trade USA is going to go monitor a factory for me and then put their seal on a product. And so I can just trust that, right? So I don't have to go to the factory myself. Emotional connection. So again, like all this production happens really far away in distant countries by people we don't know and have no connection to. So how do we shrink the distance? So we can think about made-to-order products, right? Again, increasing the agency that we have. But we can also think about other ways of increasing the emotional connection, like having the worker sign the card, right? Like, who made this? We are so divorced from production that we just have no idea. But to kind of introduce some emotion and humanity into the process may make us think about it a little bit more. Buying local, right? Again, kind of increasing the connection between the consumer and the producer. Creating norms around sustainable consumption. So again, like 80% of brides have diamond engagement rings. It's become a norm. And so if you don't have one, you feel a little weird. The same could be true with sustainability. So making these things very conspicuous, putting really public labels on things, can then turn this into a norm, and then people will feel like they need to participate. Status, again, people like social status. So Tesla, when they came into the market, they came in at the high end, and they really turned it into a status product. So it's not only a green product, but it's a status product. And finally, thinking about new business models. We have lots of really young, motivated entrepreneurs who are thinking about new ideas and new ways of doing things that are more sustainable, like Rent the Runway. Why buy a super fancy dress that you're only going to wear once, right? Why don't you just rent it and then send it back and somebody else will use it? So these become kind of interesting models that we can think about. So finally, we can think about governments and regulation. So this is probably the most impactful because they kind of solve the issue of collective action, and they're able to sort of impose a floor on companies. But in response to all the issues in the chocolate industry, Representative Eliot Engel said, there is a moral responsibility for us not to allow slavery, and child slavery in particular, in the 21st century. So what is the role of government here? And what we can see is that government can make a difference. So in just the last 5 or 10 years, all the regulations around CO2 emissions and the new requirements for automobiles has really helped jumpstart the EV industry, right? And some of the incentives they're giving to consumers as well. In New York State, they're trying to pass the Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act. Again, creating kind of a floor so that all companies have to meet a certain level of sustainable production and a certain level of labor practices. And what government really can help do is to set a floor, right? So again, we're thinking about negative externalities. And if I don't have to pay for the mess I make, I can charge a lower price, right? And then there ends up being kind of like a race to the bottom. And so what a government can do is set a floor. So all companies have to compete at the same level. And you'll see that sometimes companies actually do want these regulations because they want to do the right thing. But if they do the right thing, their competitor will come in and charge a cheaper price. And so sometimes having a regulation sets a floor for everybody. And so nobody can go below that level. And so now we're all playing on a level playing field. Government can also solve the collective action problem for consumers. So as a consumer, I go into the store and I say, okay, I'm going to try and buy something sustainable. But I don't feel very efficacious, right? Again, it's just me, and the product was, there's just too much going on. It's just me. So again, governments can actually help with that as well. And then we can also think about political economy, right? So governments can invest in new technologies, and then those technologies can become cheaper. So we think about solar and wind and hydro power. In order to be competitive with oil, we need to invest money in those and bring the costs down. And that comes from additional experience, economies of scale, et cetera. But there needs to be some investment in that. It's not going to be profitable or competitive at the beginning, but over time, some policies can help. So really, we kind of need to think about regulation and consumer demand, both kind of influencing this process. So just in summary, what we've talked about is the growth imperative that we are all being marketed to for things we need, like tomatoes, but maybe even things that we don't need, right? Like kind of more manufactured needs, like diamonds. And that we are motivated to not really care, like the system is kind of set up that way. And that, we need to kind of think about all these three players, companies, consumers, and governments, to kind of figure out how to solve the problem. And in summary, when we think about these negative externalities, what we really need to do is we need to figure out how to share, right? Like not consume too much, share, excuse me, clean up our mess, right? We don't want to pollute too much, and be kind to others, right? Good labor conditions. I think these are all things we kind of learn in kindergarten. And so I think in general, we want to think about how do we kind of use these first principles, right? And kind of bring them back into our whole system of consumption, production and consumption. So with that, I will conclude and take some questions.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Brian Alexander in the politics department. Isn't there, aren't we relying, I appreciate this because I talk to my students a lot about the kind of individual choices we make and the kind of ethics that should inform our behavior, and should there be sort of utilitarian logic versus kind of a more idealistic logic in what we do. And it strikes me the system, we really have very little agency as consumers, or really very little agency in a kind of free market environment. And isn't the situation just fundamentally kind of tragic? Because what agency we have is minimal, and then even if you try to make big sacrifices for yourself, you're not making any difference, because 1/8 billionth of a difference isn't really going to save the world. Isn't our situation more tragic unless you just radically eliminate the market and highly regulate most production and consumption?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd say tragic, but I would say, okay, so I would.
But I think it is, like, it's tragic in the sense that we might know that what we're doing is bad, but
Yeah.
we don't have any real control
we don't
over
really
the
have
direction we're going. So it's like,
Yeah, throw your hands up.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
not even like Shakespearean tragic. We know it's bad, but hey, we can't help ourselves.
Yeah.
It's tragic in the sense that we know what we're doing, it's terrible, and we're
Right.
doomed.
Yeah, I think after like thinking about this, I feel like the real lever is some kind of regulation, right? That's really kind of what can, again, like kind of create the market for EVs or create kind of a floor for fashion in New York, which would then, I think, if that ever passes, will become kind of standard. So I think that's a big thing, but I feel like there does have to be an appetite for it amongst consumers too, because they're the ones who can kind of push the legislation, right? Like they're the ones who can kind of push that. But as a consumer, you know, every little choice you make, yeah, it has like a little drop in the pot. And so there are things that you can do though as a company if you're trying to get consumers to actually like spend money on these kind of more sustainable products. Like I had mentioned some of the strategies. There are ways to kind of make production seem less alienated from consumption, right? Like kind of bringing it closer, kind of creating emotional connection, trying to create some more agency. I would say they're not like game changers though, right? Like if you're thinking about mainstream, they're not game changers, but we are seeing over time, especially like in the last like 5 years, a lot more sustainable brands pop up. They're small and they're kind of internet brands, but that's putting pressure on all the other brands to articulate. I'm talking about clothing in particular. There's of course lots of different industries, but that is putting pressure on all the other brands. So like now all the other brands have like sustainability statements on their website, and they have like a small assortment of products you can buy, but it's kind of slow moving.
So I don't want to monopolize. I'm happy to. But can I quick? So there's a utilitarian logic that yeah, we could sort of identify practices that are going to contribute in however infinitesimally 1/8 billionth of a difference to the problem. What do you think about the choice though? And I don't know if you were alluding to this if you would have the child making clothes in your basement, but the Ursula K. Le Guin story, the ones who walk away from Omelas, which is to say that we're all sort of dependent on the suffering of others for our daily conveniences. What do you think about an idealistic moral choice, which is to say just step away from it altogether? If you can't find a sustainable suit, then don't wear something else. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so the throw your hands up thing is one question, but like when you really think about it, when the system is set up so that you don't care, like you wouldn't lock a kid in your basement, right? So that would make you think like I just shouldn't consume. But to some extent you have to, right? Like you can buy used clothes, right? You could buy used clothes, but again, like, it's a burden, right? Like how much time do you have? Like I'm just like barely have like 15 minutes to try and go buy a suit jacket, right? If you have a family and stuff. So, is this hopeless comment is starting to sound more real. But again, I think I think from a consumer's perspective, it's hard. It's hard because then I think honestly, like as a consumer, you should expect that the products that are offered to you are made up in a certain way, right? Like up to a certain standard, and we should rely on our governments to guarantee what those standards are. But there is a failing in the system. And so whether the ultimate leverage point is the consumer, I think to some extent they have some political power. But in terms of their daily choices, I don't know that that's what's going to kind of turn the whole thing. I think it's probably more government.
Who did you see? Oh, sorry, we'll go you and then
Hi, Colin Reed from Accounting and Finance. Good to see you again. I just wanted to ask you what role you think just business formations play in the sense of like the Patagonia example. It's a great example. They've been thinking about this for years, and Yvon Chouinard, I think, took out that ad in like the New York Times on Black Friday, right? And said, don't buy our stuff.
Yeah.
But it's a private company, right? That he owns, and so if he's comfortable with that, he doesn't have to answer to, his investors or stockholders or anything like that. But many of these other sort of forces driving this is corporations, right? Because they're always trying to hit the quarterly earnings target. So how much of it is like a business formation problem?
Right. I mean, you're into corporate governance, right? So like, I think the McDonald's example is interesting, right? Because that That isn't about, I mean, 9% of your revenues, right? Like, that's huge for a political issue. So what would you say as someone who does business, governance, right? Like, I mean, I think, yeah, definitely shareholder value, that's really what's driving things. But there does seem to be more of a pressure in the last, 10 years or so on companies to not only be thinking about shareholder value, but thinking about these kind of moral, political, social issues. And I think that really started with Chick-fil-A. Actually, that became like sort of like this chicken sandwich became this like moral symbol to people. And then it just kind of snowballed. Like it Parkland shootings, the Trump administration, and so then companies started taking these political positions, and then it sort of almost like is morphing into an expectation. And so if they don't do it, then they almost get punished from the consumers. So I don't know, is the shareholder value argument morphing into a stakeholder, kind of more of a stakeholder argument as opposed to just shareholders? Do you think that's changing? Yeah.
I think it could. I mean, like with McDonald's, for example, I'm probably skeptical of their decision in the sense that they're worried about the blowback that they would get if they remained, right?
Yeah.
I think Starbucks makes a move, and a few companies make a move, and it sets great precedent, right? Because then you don't want to be the only corporation doing business in Russia.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and that's the other thing. Once one company takes a stand, it kind of puts pressure on everybody else, right? And really the only ones, I have like another line of research on this like political activism that companies do. And it's really like the first mover who benefits the most. Everybody else is kind of, after that, you're kind of like, if you don't do something, you'll get criticized, and if you do something, you were too late. So like no matter what, you don't really get the benefit. But if you're the first mover, you tend to benefit more. But I do think there is more pressure for companies not to just be all about shareholder value.
Hi, my name's Brad Singer. I'm a sophomore politics major, and you mentioned several times regulation, and I think you mentioned one example in New York State with legislation relating to the fashion industry. For regulation in like the United States, for example, where do you see the primary battleground for pushing forward legislation for regulation, like on a federal level, on a state level? Where do you see most of the current activism happening, and where do you think it should be going forward?
Yeah. So I'm not a political scientist. That's probably not my strongest area, but you do see a lot of stuff happening at the state level. Like in the state of California, they made some laws about emission standards that were really, really strict. That in like, I can't remember how many years, but they have to get down to like X percent of emissions in like 10 or 20 years. And that, I think it was like fully EV by 2030 or 2040 or something. But I think when the states do it, that kind of filters up to the federal level. I mean, and the states, like these really, really high-powered states like California have a lot of power. So if you're a company and you have to clean up your act in order to sell in New York, are you going to leave? Are you going to just like exit New York, or are you going to just clean up your whole act? So I think some of these states, these like bigger states, have a lot of power to put pressure on these companies, even if it doesn't go to the federal level. But you have to get your ducks in a row so you can sell in California. That means you kind of just have to get your ducks in a row in general. So they're big enough markets, they have a leverage. Some of the bigger states.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we have time for one more question. Maybe two.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Sandberg, and I work in film and theater. I have a question about regulation of regulation. So let's take the chocolate industry, for example. So cocoa manufacturers can claim that they have sustainable practices and put that on their label. And then, I'm just thinking of one company in particular that then was found out to not have sustainable practices at all. And so, how does regulation of regulation function?
Yeah, that's a great question. We were talking about that at lunch today. So what we were talking about how is the organic label apparently isn't monitored. So any farm or producer of food can just say like, oh, I'm producing organically and put the label on their product, but there isn't any accountability. In the chocolate industry also, a lot of producers say they're fair trade, but then it turns out that they like 1 in 10 farms actually gets visited by a monitor, and they get a heads up that the monitor's coming, so then they hide all the kids, you know? So I think that's tragic, because consumers are willing to pay more for somebody to certify that a product is made up to a certain standard, and that is what you're paying for. You're paying for the certification, and the certification includes monitoring. And if you're not monitoring effectively, there's no value in that certification. And I mean, like, theoretically, that's what that 15% extra is going towards, right? It's going towards producing sustainably and monitoring. But that needs to be baked into the equation. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart.
All right, one final question.
Hi, my name is Leslie, and I'm a computer science major. And so you talked about how consumers want to buy sustainable items, but they do not. So what can you say about consumers that would be willing to pay, but they cannot pay because they just can't shoulder that green tax?
They can't shoulder, yeah, like the green tax, yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, I kind of go to like, there's like a certain, the argument can go in like both directions. Like you can use that argument to justify slavery, right? Like you really could use that argument to justify slavery. Like, well, I can't afford to buy products not made with slavery, so therefore it's okay to have slavery. Like I feel like on some level, there is just something about that argument doesn't quite hold water. Like there's gotta be a certain standard that we all agree upon. And I feel like that the evidence of that is that we do have labor and environmental regulations in this country, right? We set a floor here. And if we didn't, the products would be even cheaper. And then there would be a tax, right? Oh, well, if we paid everyone a minimum wage, there would be a tax, and like we wouldn't be able to afford products. So I feel like it's a complicated argument, but we have to kind of sort of like collectively agree that we're not gonna do certain things for the common good, right? And again, it's like, if you think of it as a negative externality, what should we be consuming things if it means that in order to produce them, we have to like pollute everything, right? Like, just like kindergarten, don't take out a toy unless you're gonna put it away, right? Like, it's kind of the same principle. And so I feel like when you talk about it as a negative externality, that is way more justifiable than like, oh, green, sustainable, right? It's like, yeah, you shouldn't pollute the commons. You're like imposing a tax on everybody else. You know, like, why should it be that you get to pollute and the whole world has to pay for it, and then only certain people benefit from that? That is unfair on some level, right? I know. That's my personal view.
Thanks so much. All right.
Thank you.
So I would like to invite all of you to attend Catherine Hayhoe's virtual lecture on Monday at 5 p.m. I think you'll really enjoy it. We'll be talking about some of these issues of sustainability that we talked about tonight. So see you then.